I've got a few thanks to make. So thank you very much to the Arts Council England, who got me started on doing these conversations. They've given me some money to help me digitise a lot of Duncan Williamson's tapes. So Duncan Williamson was a fantastic Scottish traveller storyteller who gave me several boxes of his reel-to-reel recordings of him. And so I've had time this year, with help from some crowdfunders as well, to digitise those tapes and to listen to them and to think about them and to start about thinking how to share those stories and taking the tradition on. That's where that started, talking about Duncan, talking about Scottish traveller tradition. And we're now starting to move into the tradition more generally and just really think about what storytelling is and why it's important and if it's different in different places. And I also need to say thank you to Get a Word in Edgeways, whose Zoom I'm using, which gives me this posh webinar function. So thank you very much to Get a Word in Edgeways. It's very much appreciated. So I think those are all the bits and pieces that I have to say at the beginning. So I can now welcome the wonderful storyteller that is Tom Muir. Hooray!
Thank you, but not so big a build-up. I mean, I might be crap, and then, you know, people will be disappointed. You're getting their hopes up here.
Well, we have not actually met in person. We've only met in online. But since I started taking the tradition on, your name has been mentioned almost every week by going, when are you going to get Tom Muir on? Because he's really good. You really need to have Tom Muir on. Bob Pegg's been going on about you. Mari's been going on about you. Liz Weir's been going on about you. Fiona McDougall, Heather Yule, they've all been, when are you going to get Tom Muir on? So, everybody, here he is. And I don't think you're going to be crap. I think you're going to be marvellous.
I'll do my best.
So, for those of you who don't know Tom, you're going to know him a lot better in an hour's time. And Tom really is the voice of Orkney, particularly the storytelling voice. But I think generally you are kind of one of the people that is there to talk about Orkney, its folk traditions, its life in general. And you're kind of one of the people, if you search for Orkney online, you're going to find Tom pretty rapidly. You're associated with the museum. You've got lots of books about Orkney that you've written. You're doing this fantastic thing, Tales for Troubled Times, at the moment. So again, you can hear those stories. But I'm looking at the list of people that we've got in, and I know that there are going to be some people who have been to Orkney and who are very, very familiar with Orkney. And there are other people who are going to know it's somewhere north and it sounds really nice. And they might not know exactly where it is, and they probably won't know what it's like. So you're so associated with Orkney. I'd really like you to tell us just a little bit about it.
Well, Orkney is a group of about 72 islands off the northernmost tip of Scotland. So you go as far north as you can in Scotland, and then you have to catch a ferry and go a bit further north. So that's where we are. It's one large island with a whole group of islands surrounding it on the south and the north. So my parents were from the North Isles, Westray and Sandy, and I was born in the East Mainland on Tankiness. So this is the mainland. And
how big is the mainland?
Oh, hell's teeth. About 30 miles across and about maybe 15, 20 miles from north to south.
So it's probably slightly smaller than Shropshire, where I live.
Probably. It's usually smaller than anywhere. But we always refer to Scotland as South. So it's South, over there somewhere. So.
How many of the islands are inhabited?
There's about 17 that are inhabited, but there are, there's a couple anyway, that there's only one family on the island, which makes it particularly difficult. I'd imagine during lockdown, it would make it extremely difficult. But usually there's, you know, a population of about 500 at the most or so, and so on some of the islands. Most of them are all centred on the mainland. There's two main towns, there's Kirkwall and there's Stromness. And I'm in Stromness. That's where I live now.
Well, I'm guessing it must be pretty strange for you in lockdown as well, because I imagine that the residents of mainland kind of maybe triple or quadruple in the summer.
Oh, during the course of a day, I mean, we are the second most popular site in the world for cruise ships,
Wow.
and we get and we get inundated with people. You know, you'll get thousands of people coming in a day, and they close off the streets in Kirkwall because it's just like a tide of people come up the streets and you can't move. And the population of Orkney is sort of, you know, boosted by about 25%, you know, instantly. So, but during the summer, there's a lot of tourists here because of the Neolithic remains. We have monuments here, we have stone circles, we have tombs, we have Stone Age villages built in stone, and periods going on with Viking. And so there's a hell of a lot of archaeology. There's an old saying that if you scratch Orkney, it bleeds archaeology. It's so true.
And you'd imagine that somewhere that has that much archaeology has just got to be have an equal amount, at least, of folklore that goes hand in hand with that. Is that true?
Yeah, there's a lot of folklore tied up with the ancient monuments, with the sites themselves. The stone circle at Ring of Brodgar is a group of dancing giants that got a bit carried away and didn't keep an eye on the time, and the sun rose and turned them to stone. There's trows, living mounds. The trows are the fairy folk in Orkney and Shetland. Shetland is further north from here, but another group of islands. And so yeah, there's a lot of folklore. There's, you know, selkie folk. There's Finn folk who live on floating islands on the sea or in cities under the sea. So yeah, there is a lot. Although there would have been a hell of a lot more, but it got kind of stamped on in the mid 19th century, and people started to almost despise it. You know, it was old fashioned. It was pointless. It was a worthless thing, and so people just turned their back on it, which is very sad, I think.
It is incredibly sad, but I don't think it's sadly, I don't think it's a unique story. I know
Mm.
the only place that that's happened. So how did you come to storytelling?
Well, I mean, I'd um, always loved stories all my life. Really got into folk tales and mythology through Chakanori, you know, that TV program for kids where they would serialize stories or they would read like one story a day. And it was all famous actors of the time. I mean, one of the people who was a regular on it was Judi Dench. You know, this is back in the early 70s. Um, so I had a love from of that. And I used to just love stories and learn them and tell them to a captive audience, which were the animals on the farm when I was born, who
And
had no option.
and did were you aware of the folklore around you? I mean, were you told sort of bits of folklore and stories about kind of the trows and the
No,
archaeological remains?
no, nobody of my generation had that, you know. It was something that was remembered as being something from the past, but very much from the past, you know. And so no, that just it just had been swept under the carpet, I'm afraid.
So it's sort of all round you and slumbering, and you've got this love of Jackanory,
Mm.
but nobody's telling you any stories. So how did you discover that it was there, and how did you
Well,
start getting involved with it?
I was I was buying books of folk tales because I loved them. Um, and then I was loaned a copy of Ernest Marwick's Folklore of Orkney and Shetland, and I read about a guy called Walter Trail Dennison, who was a collector in Sandy in the 19th century. And it was the first time I was aware that there was Orkney folk tales. And I would have been about 20, 21. And so, yeah, I'm probably actually about 19 or 20, actually. So little did I know that about 10 years later, I would actually be republishing Denison's work, because dyslexic, school was a waste of time. So for our mutual sanity, I left at 14. Well, I just didn't go back after I was 14. And so I went into archaeology, as you do. There was a dig going on, and so I joined that. And I always loved history and archaeology, and so it just that fitted very well. And then I got a job at the museum in 1988 for 3 months. So I'm still
How old
there.
were you at that point?
Hmm?
How old were you then?
25.
Still pretty young then.
Well,
And
I
young,
lied,
but
lied about my age to get into the museum. I my boss at the time, Bryce Wilson, got me to do a display about the Orkney Bar game. It's a mass football game played in the streets of Kirkle on Christmas Day and New Year's Day, and it's legalized violence. And so I did this display, and then it was 1994 was Walter Trell Denison's centenary year, the centenary of his death. And Bryce wanted an exhibition about him and said, well, you like folklore and your dad's from Sandy, so you can do it. So that's how I started. I wrote the exhibition, which is, for a dyslexic, was not a comfortable experience at all. I still don't even write shopping lists, I don't write, but well, now I write for a living, ironically. But back in those days, I avoided it like the plague. And so I wrote this exhibition and compiled the book, Orkney Folklore and Sea Legends. And I had persuaded my boss to come out of retirement as an artist and do the illustrations for it, because he used to be principal art teacher here in Stromness. And he enjoyed doing it and said, what will we do next? And so I said, well, why not do the book of Orkney folk tales that I've been waiting for somebody to do all my life, and nobody has, and nobody will, because nobody was working in it. So that's where the research started for Mermaid Bride, and he started producing beautiful, beautiful illustrations, which I just thought, got to. All those drawings that are made up of tiny dots, pointillist style. So it's just tiny dots to build up a picture. And I'm on page 17, by the way. Me and the fairies. So then I was asked.
There's page 17. I have to say, they are beautiful drawings, and it's a very beautiful book, and the stories in it are fantastic.
Thank you.
And I've had this book for quite a while now, and it was only today that I actually kind of re-looked at the name, because I hadn't had a person to connect to me. Oh, you're him.
It's him, yeah.
And so I feel like I kind of suddenly actually I have known you for a while through those stories.
That's nice. That's a lovely thing to think.
Yeah.
Thank you. But after the Denison book, I was asked by Aberdeen University to be on their evening lecture circuit in Orkney, doing Orkney folklore. And so I thought, well, rather than going blah, blah, blah and giving lots of descriptions, just a brief description of the creature and then tell a story, because that's what I would have enjoyed. I had actually done some storytelling to a group of Dutch students in the Kirkle Youth Hostel, because friends of mine ran it, and I was asked, they specifically asked for some stories. And that was probably the first time that I told stories to a group of people who I didn't know. And that was about 30 years ago, I think, this year. So then I started going around the islands and doing, telling these stories, and then people just asked me to come back and carry on doing it. And then I started meeting other storytellers because I didn't know that there were any. You know, I was living in splendid isolation here. You know, I had no idea that there was festivals and stuff. Absolutely clueless. And it came as a wonderful revelation that to discover that there was a community out there that I knew nothing about.
So that point of kind of publishing the book, I mean, I think it sounds like quite a turning point for Orkney, really. So there's this place where the folklore's just been denigrated and just really regarded as something that is not for us anymore, and something almost to be ashamed of. And so, and you release the book. Was there still kind of a kickback against that, of kind of what you're bothering with all that rubbish for, or is it something that people needed? And what response did you get to it? And why did you think it was so important to do?
Well, we, to answer the first point first, there were people saying, you know, why are you, there was one guy said, why are you bothering me, you know, dirt? From the Old Norse perspective, drit, meaning shit. So it's like, why are you bothering with that? And I said, because I like, you know, dirt. You know, I love the stories. And it filled me with a great excitement and wonder and delight and, you know, passion that I just didn't really get with anything else. And but I remember doing one for I was invited to this old folks club to tell some stories. And when I was finished, there was there was a round of applause. And then this old woman sitting in the front row said, well, if that's the best they can do, I won't be coming back next week. And it was like, it was shot down in flames, you know. But it was mostly among the old people that had been brought up to believe that this was worthless, superstitious, old-fashioned nonsense and not worth bothering with. But younger people, by which I mean under 75, there was a lot of people that were really deeply enthusiastic about it and excited about it coming out, and this was great. And then I did some kids books as well, which were used in schools. And I still, you know, part of my job at the museum is I go into schools and I either talk about history or I tell stories usually. So folklore is very much back on the curriculum again in schools in Orkney. Whereas in my day, that would never have happened, you know. But
What do you think kind of bringing those tales back to Orkney has given to Orkney? What difference has it made that people are starting to hear and know those stories?
well, as I keep telling people, we have our own Icelandic saga here, the Orkney saga, of the story of the Earls of Orkney, because this was a Viking power base from the 900s through to the 12th century. It was a very important power base and ruled the north of Scotland. Caithness, part of Sutherland, Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland were all ruled from here. And so Orkney Saga is something that's taught in schools and it's well known. And I think that the folktales are every bit as important as Orkney Saga. And I think that Orkney Saga is extremely important. So I think that it's part of our cultural heritage, and it's a very important part of who we are.
Why? Just because I agree with you, but kind of, and it can be hard to put into words, but what do they give you that is part of who you are? I mean, how can you give some examples of kind of things that are very uniquely Orcadian from Orkney are kind of?
Well, I think that it's values is what it comes down to. It's things that are important to you. And a lot of the stories are about community. It's about sharing. It's about looking after each other. which is the way that things were when I was a child. I was just born at the tail end of a system where you had small farms like the one I was born on, all joining together to, like buy a piece of machinery like a baler or a binder for cutting oats and binding sheaves. And then all the people from the farms all went around, in a sort of gang to work on each farm to get the harvest in. And you relied on each other. And I think in the stories, there's a lot of that kind of spirit of hardy independence. We're a very kind of proud and stubborn people. Some people would claim. He says, looking over at where his wife is sitting in the corner, who's laughing. Um, but yeah, I just think it's something that is particularly Arcadian, and there are stories that you just. I mean, it's a cultural crossroads here between the Celtic and Scandinavian worlds, but there are stories that are uniquely Orkney as well, and like the Finn folk with their vanishing islands and cities under the sea and such like that. The descriptions of them is quite unique, quite a unique thing.
I'm going to put you on the spot now because I don't know very many stories of the Finn folk, and I'd love to hear one. But I mean, if there's something else you'd rather tell us, it's fine. But I'd love to hear a Finn folk story.
Yeah, sure. There was a farmer lived in the North Isles, and he had a small croft, but he had a fishing boat, so he used to go to the fishing. And he would go out with his two sons. Now, the one day he sent his daughter down to the shore to fetch bait because it was they used hooks in those days, long lines with lots of hooks on them. So his daughter went down to the shore and she never came back. And they went searching for her and they found a bucket of bait lying on the shore. And the bait was scattered, the shellfish, the limpets she'd been knocking from the rocks were all lying scattered on the shore. And there was no sign of her. So they thought she must have fallen in the sea and drowned. But they searched for her, but there was no sign of her. So they gave her up for lost. And a few years later, they were out at the fishing, the father and the two sons, and fog came down, which is something that happens here in the summertime quite a lot. It's if you get a hot day, you get the cold sea from the North Sea. The fog comes rolling in, and they didn't know where they were, and they knew it was dangerous because they could hit a rock and sink, or they could drift out into the Atlantic Ocean. And when the fog lifted, there'd be no sign of land. So they were being very cautious, and eventually they saw a dark shape in the distance, and so they headed towards it. And it was an island, but they didn't recognize it. So they pulled the boat up on the shore, and they had a look around, didn't recognize the place, but they saw that there was a road, a little path leading somewhere. So they thought, well, it's got to go somewhere. So they followed it, and they came to a great big house. And this house was far bigger than the laird's house, the local landowner. It was a wonderful, beautiful mansion house. So they went and knocked on the door, and who should answer it but the man's daughter? So he was overjoyed to see her and said, how did you end up here? So she said, come in and I'll tell you. So they went inside, and if the outside of the house was impressive, the inside was beautiful. And she said, well, the day that I went down to the shore to gather bait, I forgot what you warned me, and I turned my back to the sea, and a Finn man came out the sea and grabbed me and pulled me into his boat. Now, Finn folk always use oars, they don't use sail, but they are also powerful sorcerers, and they can travel huge distances with just one stroke of the oar. They can go from here to Iceland in 7 strokes of an oar. So she was so frightened, she said, that she forgot to ask a blessing on herself, which would have meant he would have lost his power over her. But he dragged her in the boat and rowed away, took her to this island, and she'd lived there ever since. And she said he's my husband now, and you'll meet him soon. He's coming home. So in a short time, the door opens and in comes the Finn man, a tall man with black hair and the black moustache and beard. And she introduces him, and he's delighted to meet them and says, I've heard a lot about you. And so the father and the Finn man are chatting away to each other. And the father's always trying to steer the conversation towards, where are we? What island is this? But the Finn man is too fly for that. He turns the conversation around to something else, never gives a clue as to where they are. But eventually he says, I've been wondering if you have any cattle to sell. And the man said, yes, I've got a fine cow in the byre, Brenda, our best milker. And I can sell her to, I was going to take her to the market. And he said, no, save you the bother, I'll give you a good price for her. And he gave him a bag full of gold coins. And the man was amazed. He'd never seen so much money in his life before. And then he thought, now I can find out where I am. So he said to him, so what island is this, so that I know where to bring the cow? And he said, oh, don't worry about that. I'll sort that out myself. But he says, I think there's a meal ready. And sure enough, there was a lovely meal set out of fish, of course. And they sat down and ate it. And the man, although he'd lived on fish all his life, thought it was the finest fish he'd ever tasted. Now, one of the sons looked out the window and said, I think the fog's lifting, Dad. And the Finn man said, yes, it's safe for you to leave now. So they're leaving the house. And the daughter says to her father, Father, is there anything that you would maybe like to take with you? Any treasure in the house that you maybe would kind of like to sort of, take home with you? And he looked at her and smiled and he said, yes, there is a treasure that I would like to take home with me. And the Finn man said, just name it and it's yours. So the father smiled at his daughter and she smiled back. And he said, you see that big gold plate on the dresser over there? And the Finn man said, take it, it's yours. So he took the gold dish and he headed out to the door. Well, the poor daughter, of course, she was a bit crestfallen because obviously he thought that she would choose her. But he probably thought that she'd actually landed on her feet. She had it pretty good there. Whereas back home, there was lots of hunger and hard work. And so she probably thought she'd done all right. So they went down to the boat and the Finn man said, just pull away and you'll be home in no time. And the daughter said to her father, I've got you a gift. And so she gave him a knife with a beautiful carved handle. And she said, keep hold of this knife as a token, and it will give you the power to see this island again. And you'll be able to find your way back here and visit me. So they pushed the boat off into the sea. And as the father jumped over the stern of the boat, the knife fell from his hands, slipped through his fingers, and fell into the sea with a splash and was gone, lost. And the next thing they knew, they were surrounded by fog again. And in no time at all, they came out of it and they discovered that they were in the bay right below the house where they lived. There was the boat noused, where he pulled the boat up into. There was the house. So they pulled the boat up and secured it and they headed home. And they met the old man's wife. On the way, she said, I was so worried about you. I thought you'd been lost. And he said, no, we're fine, we're fine. And she goes, well, I'll tell you something that's not so fine. She says, what? And he says, well, it's Brenda, our cool Brenda. What about her? He said, oh, she's gone. And he said, gone? What do you mean gone? And she said, well, gone. I mean, how many gones are there? Gone as in not there anymore. And I went out and she's not in the byre. And then the man realized that the Finn man had come for her. You see, they're powerful sorcerers, as I said, and he'd come and spirited the cow away. And he said, don't worry about her. She was well paid for. He showed her the bag of gold coins and the big gold dish. And he told them how their daughter was living on this magic island that we know as Hildeland. And So that was that. He ended up having quite a lot of money, and he was able to build a bigger house for himself and a bit more land. And after that, when he went fishing, it was because he enjoyed fishing, not because he needed to. But the thing was, he'd lost that knife, and so he never had the power to see that island again or to visit his daughter. So I don't think he was that well off after all. Do you?
Well, I bet there was a certain words were had by his wife. I can't imagine.
Depends how much he told her.
True enough, but obviously enough that the rest of the stories got out to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But a
Well,
beautiful
there you
story.
go. I'm famous for blabbing.
Oh, well, and everybody's just saying, oh, wonderful. And Heather's saying, I've always loved that story. And it's a great story. And great. Thank you for, yeah, Stories of Finfolk, which is just, has got a definite atmosphere, I think. It's got a real atmosphere of place about it.
And I've seen it. I mean, it has two names here. There's Heather Blether, is what people in Rousey call it, and it's seen out in the Atlantic Ocean because we've got the North Sea on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other. But when I was a youth, probably about 18, 19 or something, I was out at the farm where I was born visiting and went for a walk with a couple of my brothers. And we saw an island between the island of Shappensea and Stronsea that just shouldn't have been there. And one of my brothers had a pair of binoculars. So we looked at it through binoculars and you could see a big house on it with an arched doorway. And yet there was no island there. And very slowly it began to melt away. It started on the left-hand side, the west coast, started to melt away and lift and shimmer, and so did the east side. And eventually it was just this middle section with a big house on it. It was all that could be seen. Now, an unromantic person could say that it was probably the island of Sandy, which would normally wouldn't be visible, but it was a very humid summer's afternoon. So you could get refracted light and have these images brought nearer. But they were known as Hildeland, which is an Old Norse word, like our dialect here is Old Norse. And it means a shimmering mirage on the surface of the sea. So it's well known about. So it's hardly surprising that there's stories about that.
Well, absolutely. And did you know the story before or after you saw it?
I would have been aware of the story before that, but I mean, there it was, in all its glory. So there was no kind of disputing it, because there was three of us.
What a gift, and a gift to
We're
have
sober. It's not as if we were.
as well.
It's not like, well, it was one hogmanay. It was just a Sunday afternoon.
Well, we've got a representative from Norway here as well. And you are sort of, like you were saying, you're kind of just in that current between the different cultures and different islands. And since you've begun storytelling, I mean, from kind of being in this very small place and starting to explore your own folklore, not knowing that there's any other storytellers anywhere, you've been all over the place. I mean, it's not just a thing of kind of the Orcadians kind of recognizing and remembering their stories. There's been this huge demand for it around the world. And is there anything particular that people say about the stories when they hear them, or that you think that they like them for a particular reason, or there's a need that they're satisfying?
Well, a lot of people in Scandinavia recognize ones, and the same with Faroes and Iceland as well. They recognize stories. But the one thing that I've always noticed, the selkie stories, the selkie folk, that goes down particularly well with females of all ages, from little girls at school who say, you know, tell us a selkie story, to adults. It's a story that resonates with women. I think it's that kind of, you know, losing your skin and losing your identity in a way.
The Selkie
Um,
Bride, rather than
mhm,
Selkie stories generally, that particular one where he
yeah,
steals her
mhm,
skin.
yeah, that resonates, I think, with a lot. And my wife, I'm sure, will agree that it was the story that resonated most with her. And she was writing a young adult's fiction, fantasy story based on Selkie story, set in Rackwick on Hoy, and that's when she got in touch with me. You know, which is knocking on 20 years ago. But then there was nothing for a long time until 6 years ago, and we got back in touch then, and ended up falling in love and getting married because of Selkies.
Congratulations. I mean, for people who don't know that story, I think
Mm.
it's quite controversial. It's quite a contentious story. It's so well, you should tell it because I might know a different version to you. The one.
Well, there are different versions. I mean, there are many different versions. The one I like comes from the parish of Dearness in the East Mainland, where near where I was born. There was a young man walking home one night late, and he heard music. Now it's very strange because where would music be coming from at that time of night? Out there on the shore. So he went very carefully because he didn't know who was playing the music and what kind of a welcome he would get. So he went very carefully along the shore and he hid behind a rocky outcrop and he peeped around the corner. And the rocky beach finished and there was a sandy bay. And on the sandy bay, there was lots of people dancing. And all around them, there was shapes like animals lying asleep. And on a flat rock, there sat two men playing fiddles, and that's where the music was coming from. And he very carefully went down on his belly and crawled along the beach. And he went to where these animals were lying to see what they were. And he discovered that they were seals. Well, seal skins, empty seal skins. And then he realized that this was the night that the Selkie folk have the power to come ashore and take off their skins and become human again. Because people thought that they were the souls of people who had drowned, especially suicides. So one of the skins was a beautiful silvery colored skin. So he rolled it up and he hid it under his jacket and he went back to his hiding place. Now, the Selkie folk have to live in the sea, but they can come ashore at certain times of the tide and take on human form and dance again. But as soon as the sun rises, they have to go back to the sea and back into seal form. And so they all grabbed their skins, pulled them on, went back into the sea and swam away, except for one young woman who was searching frantically among the rocks, looking for her skin. Now, in her panic, she ran right around the corner and straight into this young man's arms. And he looked down into her beautiful face and he looked at her beautiful brown eyes, staring frightened up at him. And he thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his life. And he knew that he could never be happy unless he had her as his wife. Now, she had other ideas, mind you. She punched him and kicked him and scratched him and bit him and squeaked it out of her on the Selkie tongue, because the Selkies have their own way of talking as well. But he was bigger than her and he took her home where he lived with his mother. Now, the old woman wasn't a fool. She knew exactly what this girl was. You know, here he comes with this girl in a sealskin. But she pitied her. And the poor girl sat by the side of the fire weeping. And the old woman comforted her as best as she could. And she went to the ben end of the house, to the best room in the house, and she opened a chest, and she took out a dress and gave it to the girl to wear. It was one of her old dresses that she used to wear when she was young. And it was warm, so the girl wore it, and she carried on crying, but the old woman was kind to her, spoke kindly and softly to her, and after a while the crying stopped. And the old woman taught her how to bake and brew and to cook and to spin wool and weave. And the man was always kind to her as well, and she was obviously very attached to him. She followed him around everywhere. And so it was no surprise when the two of them were married. And soon there were children. They had a family, they had bairns. And they were very happy together. And one day the selkie wife took her husband to one side and she said, "Look, you know that I'm a creature of the sea. And I know that you've got my skin. And I know where you keep it. You keep it in the kist, in the ben end of the hoose, in the chest. And you always keep that chest locked. And you always keep the key on you. But I want you to make me a promise. Never let me get that key, because I don't know if I can resist the temptation. So if you love me, if you really love me, then never, ever let me get that key. I don't want to leave you in the bairns." And he swore that he never would put her in that position. Now, time passed, and it was the Lammas Fair at the beginning of August. And the man decided to take the bairns into the town of Kirkwall to go to the fair. It would be a great treat for them. His wife decided to stay at home. She said without them under her feet, she could give the house a good clean. So they set off to Kirkwall, and the bairns had a wonderful day. It was one of the lovely things to eat and games to play, and just wonderful, all under the shadow of the red sandstone cathedral of St. Magnus. And when they headed home that evening, the bairns were tired and sleeping in the bottom of the cart. But when the man got nearer to his house, he could see that there was something wrong. There was no lights on in the window, and there was no smoke coming from the chimney. And when he got nearer, he could see the door was open. So he went inside and he shouted for his wife, but there was no answer. And then a terrible thought gripped him, and he ran through to the ben end, to the best room of the house. And there was the kist, with the lid standing wide open and the key in the lock. And then he realized what must have happened. In his hurry to go, got the children all washed and dressed in their best clothes, and he put on his Sunday best suit as well. But he forgot to take the key out of the pocket of his jacket. And when she was tidying up, she'd have picked up his work jacket, and she could feel that there was a key in the pocket. And she took it out and she looked at it. And she knew what that key opened and what was inside waiting for her. So she ran through to the ben end of the house, put the key in the lock and turned it, opened the lid, and there was her skin. There was her beautiful silvery skin. And when she saw it, the urge to touch it once more was too strong. And then when she touched it, the urge to pick it up was too strong. And when she'd done that, the urge just to hold it close to her was too strong. And when she felt that skin, and she could still smell the salt on it, she knew she had to go back. She ran down to the shore, and with a cry of anger and anguish, she pulled on the skin and dived into the sea and swam away as a seal. Now, the man never saw his selkie wife after that, no matter how hard he tried, and he searched for the rest of his days. But they said that when the bairns went down to the beach to play, a seal would swim backwards and forwards in front of them, sobbing like its heart was breaking. And selkies do sob. They make a range of sounds. They howl, they kind of wail on the rocks, like kind of lost souls wailing, very, very haunting sound. But I have had ones that actually sobbed like a woman. but then there would be an unearthly groan at the end of it. And then it would go back to the sobbing, and you were just convinced it was a woman sobbing her heart out. But it's a seal. So it's hardly surprising that these stories evolved around them.
There's so many questions that I want to ask you, and there's certainly ways, and Liz is asking about your kind of she's got things that she'd like me to ask you, which hopefully I might be able to squeeze in. Those two stories are so evocative, and that story, I don't know, it's got so many layers in it, and I think we all understand that kind of being torn and being wanting to be in two but it's interesting, Shane is saying he loves that story. I know a lot of women who've got a lot of problems with that story. I'm hoping that there's some strong female heroes on Orkney, because the two stories that you've told me, I just think, oh no, are all the women in folklore just like stolen by men and just pawns?
No, there's a story about Ursula Balfour on the island of Stronsay, who fell in love with a man that worked in the barn of her father. Her father was the laird. He owned the whole island. And he was wanting to marry her off to another laird's son. And she was having none of it. She didn't want to marry these chinless wonders that were being paraded in front of her. And she would always criticize them and send them packing with a flea in their ear. But she loved this man in the barn. But she always treated him really mean because she didn't want to let him know that she loved him. So when her father died, then she knew that her luck was in, because now there was no disputing that she was the only heir to his estate. All his land, all his money, they were hers now, they were safe. So she ordered the barman to go and have a shave, and get his best clothes on, and come back and get married. And he was saying, to whom? And she said, to me, of course, don't you know I love you? And he said, no. And so they got married, much against his will. But she was the laird. She got a victim, throw him out, throw his whole family out if she wanted to. But it was a loveless marriage, and she soon realized that. But being a strong woman and not wanting to try to take a lover from among the rest of the laird's sons who would blab, she decided that she would take a selkie lover, so on her own terms. So she went down to the shore and she cried 7 tears into the sea. They said it was the only tear she ever cried in her life. And as the ripples of the last tears spread across the water, a selkie's head rose up out of the sea, and it removed the skin from its face, and it said, "What do you want with me, fair maiden?" And she said, "I've made a loveless marriage, and I want to be loved and to feel warmth and passion." And he said, "So you've come to the selkie folk?" And she said, "I have." So he says, "I can only come ashore on every 7th stream, but I can give you what you want." And he did. And so soon after that, she became pregnant. And when her son was born, between every finger and every toe, there was a web of skin. And the old nurse always cut these webs of skin away, but they kept growing back. And when the child wasn't allowed to grow the skin where they were meant to be, then they moved onto the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet as a hard crust known as hard hand. And it was supposed to have existed in the island of Stronsay among the descendants of Ursula Balfour and her selkie lover. And there are people in Stronsay that have got that skin condition. So, I mean, there is a woman that decided she's having a lover on her terms.
Good for her.
So it's not a case of being, carried off.
Yeah, and I'm glad that she got a lover, because I was feeling rather sorry for her when, she decides to steal somebody's skin and just say, "You're going to marry me." And
yeah,
he doesn't end up being like a puppy and following her around because he's got nowhere else to go.
mm-hmm. basically.
So, you know, kind of she does, yeah. I'm glad you've got some strong women, because I would have thought it'd be a
Well,
place that would
we have a
strong,
story about,
strong women.
there's a story of a goddess here as well, the mother of the sea. And she rules the sea in the summertime. And she calms the storms and she gives life to all the creatures in the sea. But she has a rival, a male spirit called Terran. And Terran is bound by her and lies chained up at the bottom of the sea. But as the year passes, her strength fails from all that energy of giving life to all the creatures in the sea, calming the storms. And then Terran breaks his bonds, and the two of them fight, and that's when you get the equinox storms in the autumn. And then she is driven from the sea and has to live on land, and he rules the sea in the summer, and he raises the storms. And then all the shellfish go off to deeper waters, and the fish are less plentiful. And it's dangerous to be on the sea. And she remains as an invisible spirit on land until the spring, when she goes back into the sea and fights and defeats Terran and ties him up again at the bottom of the sea. And then her reign begins as well. So she is beloved by the people of Orkney.
Absolutely.
And I think that shows a story that goes back a long, long way, because it's, you know, it's pre-Christian, because here is a goddess. So you're not saying, you know, God made the world in 6 days and then had a day off. Oh, except for the sea, which is run by this other woman who's subcontracted it. No, it's an ancient story. I mean, it's prehistoric, I would think. You
Or Heather's saying, oh, isn't she the one that gave the mermaids their tails and powers?
know. No, there's a story that it's supposed to be Eve who got jealous when she saw the mermaid, because the mermaid was so beautiful that she thought that no men would look at mortal human women. And she tries to give her a dress to wear, but she refuses, saying that, well, she says a little rhyme. I'm the queen of the sea, and mermaid's my name. To show my fair body, I do not think shame. No clothes file my skin, no dress will I wear, but the bra tates of me bonny, bonny hair. A tate is a bunch of something that you can hold in one hand, like a bunch of hair, and that's what she means. So
Not what I had assumed.
Eve goes off to God and complains, you know, nobody's going to look at us with her sitting around there. So she's doomed then to wear a fish's tail. But the men have a caveat onto that, like the amendment, a private members bill amendment, that says that if a mortal man falls in love with a mermaid, she can take her tail off. But then the mermaids in Orkney folklore, um, the ones in the Northern Isles, they don't have tails. They have petticoats that they wear, which are tied over their feet in the sea when they're swimming, and they look like tails. And they can be sort of used with magic as well to belt. In one case, a man who had creeped up on a mermaid and gave her a kiss, and she smacked him over the side of the head with her tail and sent him flying. But eventually, she married him and lived on land with him for 7 years, but then returned to the sea with her, everything that belonged to her, including him and her children, and they never came back again. They went to visit her folks under the sea. So yeah, there's the mermaids. The mermaids are basically, it's a selkie story, but in reverse, because it's mermaids looking for men, and they are carried away, and they forget everything about their home.
That sounds fantastic. Oh gosh, we're running out of time, but it's about an hour taking the tradition on, and I do this purely as a selfish thing, so so it's about an hour, and I have no problem with us running over it. If other people, if you have things that you have to do at 9, that's fine, but we generally do tend to go over to about 1:15 and see how we do.
Yeah, yeah, I'm, you know.
Well, because I'm starting to get questions up as well, and
Mhm.
so Orkney's this place that you've kind of repeopled with all the creatures of its folklore. I mean, obviously it was there, but people had lost that direct.
Yeah, there was no access to any of these stories. You know, you really had to go and look for a long out of print book, and probably pay quite a lot of money for it if you knew it existed at all, you know.
to go looking for it.
Mm.
But it wasn't the same on Shetland, was it?
No,
There,
stories got passed down. I mean, one of my greatest friends and a man who I miss terribly because he died a couple of years ago, Lawrence Tullock. Um, Wonderful storyteller. I mean, he learned his stories from his father, Tom Tullock, who in turn learned them from his mother, and so on and so forth, all the way back. So, so that oral tradition clung on, but it was only a few people that actually preserved it. You know, it wasn't widespread. I wouldn't say it was just some
so it
families.
had been attacked in the same way that it had been on Orkney. There was just a few families that clung on a bit longer.
Yeah, well, I mean, the church was kind of down on it in the mid 19th century because it was superstition, and superstition was the work of the devil. Therefore, so that's why people kind of despised it. It ended up being that way. But in Shetland, I mean, there were people like, well, in Orkney, you had Walter Trill Denson recording things, but there was one or two, but it wasn't that many. But in Shetland, you had Chessie Saxby as well, who was gathering stories and publishing them. So they were kind of more kept going in Shetland than they were in Orkney. But there is a sad vacuum up there now that Lawrence is gone. And I'm hoping that his daughter Liz takes up the baton because she plays fiddle as well. Her grandfather on her mother's side was a very famous Shetland fiddle player. And so it was, it's kind of, I kind of hope that she does that because it's her legacy, you know. These are her stories as well.
How so? I don't know what sort of legacy Lawrence had. About I don't know how many stories he knew, but you got to meet him and you got to tour with him.
Oh yeah, we lived in each other's houses and we traveled the worlds together, you know, from Iceland to Slovenia. I mean, we had a fantastic time.
Did his telling and spending time with him affect how you started to tell the Orkney stories and how you and your relationship with those stories at all?
No, you see, I just, like I said, I didn't know anybody else was doing it, so I just developed my own, I guess, style. You know, I mean, it's, I never really thought about it too much. I just get up and tell stories. So it's, um, so I'm very much my own creation.
Fair enough.
Mm.
So I have another name that I'm probably going to get wrong, and I apologise. So Synnøve Marie Strömsberg. In fact, I'm going to ask you to come up and ask Tom your question yourself. I'm going to allow you to talk. You don't have to let me, but if you would like to ask your question yourself, then you can. Can you hear us, Sven? Sorry, Synnøve, can you talk to us? You may have to unmute yourself as well. Hello. We're allowed to talk a mind. She may not want to. Would you like to ask a question? I'm not sure she does, but she's asking, going back to the folklore about the archaeological features.
Mm-hmm.
So she is an archaeologist who loves Orkney, and she's wondering what degree have you found that the folklore explains the archaeological features and finds?
Well, like I said, the mounds were the homes of the Trows, the fairy folk, and the standing stones were petrified giants. Um, so um, there were other little bits and pieces. There was things like the polished stone axes from the Neolithic. If you found one of those, it was believed to be a thunderbolt, and so people built them into their houses on the gable end. And it was believed that, you know, lightning doesn't strike twice. So if you have got a lightning bolt buried in your house, it's not, your house isn't going to get hit by lightning. Also, flint arrowheads from the Neolithic were also kept as elf shot, they called them. And it was believed that these were shot by the fairy folk at you. If you were messing around with their mound too much, too close, then they would fire this at you. And but if you possessed one, then you were immune from harm from elf shot. So,
And what harm
um,
would come to you if you were elf shot?
hmm?
What harm would come to you if you were elf shot?
It could make you lame or crippled, and it could kill your cattle as well. If your cattle were elf shot, they would die with it. So I mean, it could kill you, or it could make you, disabled, either, um, you know, like I said, make you lame, or make you lose the power of your legs altogether. So you didn't want to mess with them. People always think of fairies as being these nice little gossamer winged wish granting creatures that with a fetish for teeth. Not up here. They're dark. They steal your children and leave changelings in their place, and they'll basically nick anything that's not nailed down, including mothers as well, who have just had a baby. They can be carried away as well, and they leave a stalk in their place, which is just a piece of wood that's bewitched to look like the person who has then died, so that you take them away and bury them, thinking that this is your loved one that died. But yeah, tricky.
Do you know what it is they particularly want with new mothers? Do they want them as
Um,
nursemaids or?
yeah, nursemaids of one of their own had died in childbirth.
Right. It sounds like, I mean, you obviously have just discovered and found so much about Orkney folklore. And and for anybody who's interested in Orkney folklore, you've published several books, and
Mhm.
you've been doing Tales for Troubled Times. There's, I think you've probably changed the atmosphere of the museum. I mean, with the museum's blessing, and it sounds like it's been a partnership um, that maybe the focus of the museum has become much more towards folklore. Is that fair?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just that it's accepted now as part of Orkney culture, heritage, and culture. Therefore, we are arts, museums, and heritage as our department. So within the local council. So it's something that is now mainstream.
You're
Whereas
the only
20,
person I know. Well, one of the very few people I know that's like a proper storyteller with a proper job.
well, you kind of have to around here. Um, I would have to travel. I mean, I do travel from time to time. I haven't really been anywhere for a while, but
None of us have.
um, well, yeah, no, I meant slightly longer than lockdown. Um, but yeah, but yeah, no, I mean, I love having lots and lots of different, I have different interests, and I'm able to indulge all of them, and it's wonderful because I can still, work in archaeology and work in history and um, modern history, and so it's a real smorgasbord of all things Orkney, which is why when my wife Rhonda wanted to start a website about Orkney, we called it orkneyology.com, because it is all things Orkney, and that's where Tales for Troubled Times ended up on, because it was my attempt to try to do something positive to help people in lockdown who are maybe, bored or struggling a bit. If for people with mental health issues, it's not been an easy time. And I suffer from depression myself, so I know what it's like. So I just wanted to do something, and I couldn't. The only things I could do was drink malt whiskey and tell stories. I don't think there was a hell of a lot of. There wasn't a big audience out there for me drinking malt whiskey. So
No, and I think with depression, then that's maybe something to do in moderation. really. But stories.
Modder what? Never heard that word before.
What do you think is the future for storytelling and Orkney? Where do you hope it's going to go from here?
Well, I just hope it keeps going up. We need more storytellers. We need more Orcadians telling stories. At the moment, it's me. It's the only like native-born Orcadian. It would be lovely to have some more Orcadians taking up the stories. But so saying, Seam's Mermaid Bride, when that came out, I also did the Orkney Folk Tales book for the History Press in 2014. So there's a lot of stories out there, and people are using those now. So people are telling Orkney stories all over and in different countries as well. And
how do you feel about that? How do you feel about people taking your stories from Orkney who might not have been in Orkney and telling them in other places?
I'm absolutely delighted, really am, because the story's going to survive. You know, if people are taking the time and the effort to tell it, to learn it and tell it, then that's great. I mean, it's, you know, it's like if you were the best baker of buns in the entire universe, you know, but you wouldn't let anybody else taste them, you know, then you're missing the point somewhat. So I think that with stories, it's wonderful that they're being shared, they're being enjoyed, and they're being kept alive. You know, it's like I think in ancient Egypt when to perpetuate somebody's name meant that you could carry on living in the afterlife. But when people forgot your name, you ceased to exist. Same with stories. If you don't tell them, then they're just going to disappear.
So what you really need is an apprentice. You thought about sort of getting the equivalent. I mean, it's not YTS scheme anymore, but
I would be very up for it. Nobody's ever asked, but if anybody did, you know, I'd be very up for it. I have helped a lot of people, and I had a pet Viking once called Hjorleifur Helgi Stephenson from Iceland. Fabulous storyteller, one of my favorites, brilliant storyteller. Um, and you know, he was just, I spotted him and thought, that's a storyteller. I hadn't even had him tell a story or anything. I just seen him and thought, just recognized once, you know, another storyteller. And he came and lived with me when he was 25. You know, this is going back 2004, and he is currently, he was writing up his stories for the History Press to do an Icelandic folk tales book, which is stories that he'd heard from his grandparents. And there are ones there that I've got a lot of books of folk tales by, and I have a lot of Icelandic ones because I've been in Iceland many times. But a lot of the stories he was telling you never had, because they're, you know, some of them are kind of borderline risque, you know. So it's like Spotted Arse the Troll, you know. It's not sort of things that the normal 19th century collectors would have written down. They would have thought it was too rude. But it's just it's wonderful. It's wonderfully dark.
there's
So
lots and lots of comments about this coming up. So yeah, Kaz would like a pet Viking. I think it's
very good
a lot
for
of people
keeping
quite like a
pecks
pet Viking.
down. Very good for keeping the pecks down here on the house. I never got bothered with pecks while he was around.
And everybody actually just, lots of people have seen him telling and saying how great he is, and
Yeah.
he always credits you as being one of his mentors, and obviously had a massive effect on him, and that he's a fantastic storyteller. It sounds like a fantastic collection of stories as well.
Well, the
Um,
good thing about Hjorleifur is that the one thing that I kind of instilled in him is just like get up and tell a story, and listen to other storytellers, but don't copy them. There's no point in copying them. You know, find your own voice and use it. Don't be a don't be a Duncan Williamson wannabe. You know, just do your own thing. I think that's individuality is a very important thing.
well, yeah, and I have to say, I mean, that was the one thing from studying with Duncan, the thing that he taught me more than anything else was that he was very, very good at being himself.
Mhm.
And
He was excellent at being himself.
he was brilliant, and he didn't care who else was in, who else was there. And I saw him with quite famous actresses. I saw him with homeless people on the street. I saw him with, you know, middle class shoppers on the train, and he was always completely and utterly himself. And that was the one thing, is just like, you know, kind of, for me, studying with Duncan was about me learning to be me, not about learning to be like Duncan.
No, no, no. And I wasn't for a
No,
second
no, no,
expecting that. I
no.
was
But
just
but
saying
I
that,
agree totally. You know,
pulling the name of a famous storyteller out of the air.
no,
But it's, yeah, it's just that case of be yourself, you know.
I think it's really important, and particularly with storytelling, for me, I would say that the difference between acting is there is no fourth wall, and it's about connecting with people, and you can't really connect with people if you're not being yourself. If you want people to open up to you, and if you want to have that space to create a story, you've got to be open and vulnerable and just be yourself. Else it doesn't work for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes. So Suneva's in a public place and she couldn't ask the question at all, but I'm just so I can just apologise if I'm saying your name wrong. But she's saying thank you for the stories, for keeping them alive, and for bringing a piece of Orkney to me when I can't be there. And I think you're doing that for an awful lot of people. I mean, particularly with all the stories that you're putting out online. And there's also, if people are, I know quite a few people are hoping to be in Orkney this summer, and if you can't be, or if you just want to go on a virtual holiday to Orkney, now you've started to hear about the stories, there is a free folklore Orkney trail.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
online, again, I think if you just put Orkney and storytelling or Orkney and Tom Muir, you will find the folklore trail, and you can follow.
Yeah, we just did that last year with Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, who were wanting to develop apps where you could go around and and hear stories or pieces of history or whatever from the place that you're visiting. And so it was just, I thought that was another way of keeping the folk tales alive. You know, it's and seeing it in the landscape. Um, there was, I've only ever had one piece of criticism about that, which seemed to be a kind of a, you know, you're doing yourself out of a living kind of thing. And I thought, no, I mean, what I've been trying to do for basically most of my life, over half my life now, is to get these stories out there so that people can enjoy them again. And this is just a modern technology using that in order to interpret the landscape through folklore, through folk tales. And I mean, you know, what am I going to do? Follow around every bloody tourist saying, "Excuse me, do you know the story about that?" I get locked up, you know. There'd be a restraining order, you know. It's, we don't want to go down that road again now, do we?
I think it's a fantastic opportunity, and I think people would listen to that wouldn't, it wouldn't occur to them to go to a storytelling event, or would know that storytelling existed.
Yeah.
If that's something that's going to catch their imagination and bring that landscape to life, then that's when they're going to start looking for more, and that's when they're going to want to go and listen to a live storyteller. So I think the two should work together brilliantly, hand in hand.
It's one of those things that you've got storytelling as being like the oldest art form in the world, you know, story. Just goes back to the dawn of language. And then using modern technology. And the two of them just fit perfectly. And so why the hell not use it? And like I said, if it preserves the story and if it keeps it going and if it generates an interest, then my work here is done.
Well, I'm afraid for today it is. We've come to that point. It's 9:15, and it's just been a delight to spend this time with you. And thank you to everybody that's come. Thank you for the questions on and all the comments on the chat. And I know that everybody else has really loved getting to hear you tell some stories and talking about your tradition and talking about Orkney. And there are lots, and as I say, so now if you want to hear more of Tom, there are lots of places that you can go and find some recorded stories online, and hopefully again live, and we can come and see you in Orkney in the not terribly distant future.
I'll be kicking around either the museum or Stromness. Depends when we get back in. It's a bit up in the air at the moment, but I'll be around. But if you go into orkneyology.com, our website, then you can contact me there anyway.
And do this is a very, very marvelous book, and I haven't got the History Press one yet, but I am going to get it. So some fantastic reading to do in lockdown as well. And Louise is saying, what an incredible place Orkney is to visit, and they're hoping to get there when they're able, and that they had an absolutely wonderful night of music and storytelling in Kirkwall when they visited, and this has brought back loads of great memories of that. So thank you very much. And everybody's just saying thank you, or a lovely evening they've had. So thank you to all the people who've come. And and between you, this is definitely the best background of bookshelves that they've seen all lockdown.
Oh, it keeps on going,
I know. Well, you put my bookshelves to say I've got this lovely little corner here, but you've got a huge library full of them. I have got slight bookshelf envy, I have to say.
Keeps me out of mischief.
So, but for now, everybody's saying that was a great night, and it was. So you can, if anybody came in late, you can catch up on YouTube, and there's some other conversations there as well that you can catch up with, and go and visit orkneyology.com, where you can hear from Rhonda, I think, as well as Tom, who's been hiding just round the corner.
Hiding in the corner.
Very quickly, when he swung the computer round, just a sort of diving out of view, I think.
I was trying to not get her in there because she asked me not to, because she's not.
Oh dear! Now we've got more questions on the Q&A, and I'm afraid they'll have to wait for another time. Shane, I think we answered your question. I'm really fascinated about this, so we're going to go. But can you tell us any more about the Odin stone? I don't know what it is. Very quickly, we fit this in, and then I will let you go.
The Odin stone is something that is tragic. You see, I was just saying to Rhonda today that I don't think in terms of years. I think in terms of millennia, because I think we do here. And the Odin stone was destroyed in 1814. It's like 206 years ago. It's so close, and yet it's gone. And it's tragic. It was an outlier of the stones of Stennis. So you had a stone circle, and then you had a stone in a field, and it had a hole through it. And it was used for various things. If you passed a baby through it, then the baby would not shake with the palsy in old age, they said, which is Parkinson's disease. And if you had an injured limb and then you could put the limb through the hole, you would be cured. But what it was most famous for was for plighting your troth. So if you and you had a lover and you went down there, you had to go through a ritual, and then you had to make the Odin oath, so to the god Odin, by holding hands through the hole in the stone and pledging yourself to each other. And it was considered as binding as a marriage. And if you died before you were married, then the person who was left had to hold the dead hand that was held in life and renounce the Odin oath. But if there was no body, say somebody was lost at sea, then you couldn't marry. And it was so binding that you couldn't do it. We had a pirate here called John Gow, and he went with his girlfriend, Helen Gordon, and plighted the troth on the Odin stone. This is 1725. And he was captured, and taken to London and executed at Wapping Dock. He was hanged on the 11th of June, 1725. And his girlfriend had to travel all the way from Orkney down to London to hold the dead hand that she'd held in life to renounce the oath. Otherwise, she would never be able to marry. So it's a very powerful ancient monument that had that folklore association with it very, very strongly. And then it was a guy from Caithness, former sea captain, Captain William Mackay. He destroyed it, saying that he was fed up with people going to visit it. But this was on a piece of basically moorland, so there was no crops being trampled or anything. But he pulled down one of the stones, two of the stones from the circle, and destroyed one of them. The other one was re-erected in 1906, but the Odin stone sadly was broken up and taken away. And if that still existed, the folklore, like I said, the importance of that as an archaeological monument and for folklore is just immense. So,
Oh, what a sad story.
I'm biting my lip here because I did promise you I wouldn't swear.
Well, it's after the watershed. It's after 9 o'clock. I don't mind. But Daniel's saying thank you very, very much, and she's saying that the Handfast Bride was just done on Radio Orkney.
Oh yeah, I was the narrator.
So could we hear that on catch up?
I'm not sure if they're looking at a place to host it, and I've offered Orkneyology as a place that it could be just archived so that people can listen to it whenever they want. That was broadcast on the 11th of June, on the anniversary of Gow's execution, when he was hanged twice because he was dangling and hadn't died, and they pulled his legs to break his neck, and the rope broke. So they had to put him back and re-hang him.
I thought normally when that happened, it was a sign that, God had decided to forgive them.
No, they didn't decide it. They didn't forgive him. He got rehung. So poor old sod. Well,
I think it is still available online because I've been sent a link to it. So if that link works, Danielle, I will put it up on my website and you can my Facebook page. So
it was weird because we were doing it in lockdown and we were doing it on Zoom. So we were all in our respective homes. I was in an attic bedroom where I record all the stories for Tales of Troubled Times. And we were just sitting there reading our lines and being recorded. And then they had to kind of piece it together.
It's amazing.
And sometimes the internet connection wasn't very good. And so they had to re-record. And so it was, it was an experience.
So Radio Orkney can do it and the Archers can't. Anyway, Daniel's saying it was absolutely wonderful and I'd love to listen to it. So thank you very much for the link, Danielle. And I'll see if I can put it on the Facebook site so we can.
Thank you. Yeah, that'll be good.
And at least what you do have is the story still. And even if the stone itself is lost, which is tragic.
Yeah. I actually wanted to have it re-erected during the millennium. It was talked about, but there was a colleague of mine at the museum was very adamant that she did not want to see it going up because she felt it cheapened the actual real monuments that was there. But I was saying, well, what they should do, because they found the stone hole that it came from, that had been excavated. So we know exactly where it was. And I thought that what they should do is to put up a carved stone that is obviously not a copy. Have it nicely decorated, maybe with the story cut into it, so that you knew where the site was. And you had a stone with a hole in it, but you knew that wasn't the original Odin stone. Yeah. But anyway, it didn't happen. So.
But the story survives.
Yeah, stories keep going.
There's been many suggestions that maybe we should have sequels to these, but I think for tonight, that is enough, because I think we could both go on quite happily all night. But
Oh God, I was wanting to tell him my favourite story, but that'll have to wait for another time.
I think we may have to have a sequel, Tom. Definitely. And I think that maybe it's time to open that bottle of malt now and to have a little sip. And Heather and lots of people are going, yes, sequel. I agree. We will chat, we will talk and see what we can do. But for now, good night to everybody. And it's been a delight to get to know you, Tom. And this might be the first proper conversation we've had, but it's not going to be the last, I hope.
Amy, I'm absolutely delighted and honoured that you asked me, and I'm delighted that people gave up their time to sit here and sit and listen to an old man rambling on. I'm becoming Grandpa Simpson or Donald Trump or something. The pointless dialogues that kind of ramble on and make no sense at all.
Right. Okay. Well, we've been saying goodnight for ages and ages.
Yep. Okay.
I'm not going to go with all the comments. They're all saying, oh, you're not old. You're lovely. We didn't give up our time. Well, you've enjoyed it. We're off. Good night, all.
Good night.